In the past, you may have heard the word holistic passed around in various fields and studies. The term, both philosophical and practical, states that the most important aspect to some topics is not just the smaller elements, but also the bigger picture. In a sense, how those small elements are interconnected. This perspective is most commonly useful in medicine, where finding a balance between physical, mental, and emotional health is seen as very important. But it's been more recently famous thanks to its sardonic representation in the famed Douglas Adams novel, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. In the book, the titular character is a detective who believes that all things in the universe are connected to such a level that believing in preposterous coincidences is the only right way to solve any mystery. If you find yourself becoming witness to the crime scene of a murder and on your way home you see a stray dog on the street, one should logically conclude that finding the true home of that dog is very important to solving the unbelievably complex conspiracy behind the murder that you have become a witness to. This is, of course, entirely ridiculous. If real detectives spent their hours presuming that what they had for breakfast is somehow important to a crime that had been committed the same day, then a lot of crimes probably wouldn't get solved. But Dirk Gently isn't a commentary on the real world, but instead on the preposterous nature of the convenient way that many fictional universes are perceived. And furthermore, the series is far from the only modern franchise to base so many of its core themes on the interconnectedness of all things. Dan Povenmire often has recalled that his mother always insisted that he never waste a single day of his summers away from school, and he did his best to follow that advice to the letter, spending many of those weeks playing in the backyard or making home movies with his family's Super 8 camera. It was an upbringing such as this that landed him a growing interest and talent in art, and as an adult he moved to California, where he sustained his passions by selling his work on street corners. Eventually he was able to move on to more mainstream work, working on such shows as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Hey Arnold, and SpongeBob SquarePants. It was during his time on The Simpsons that he met Jeff Marsh, who often is infamous for inserting Swampy into his credits because it makes his name longer than everyone else's. The two became very close and began a partnership, as they both wanted to work on a show together but didn't know how to approach it. One night, while eating by himself at a local restaurant, Dan began sketching several drawings of an unnamed triangle-headed boy, before ripping the paper out and calling his friend, announcing that he knew what they were going to do with their show. The two organized the entire concept from there and began pitching it to networks such as Fox and Nickelodeon. Time and time again, the pitch was rejected, being often described as too complicated to actually work on television. In the next 16 years, this continued like clockwork. Dan and Swampy would move on with their lives, moving to different parts of the world and working on different projects, while always carrying their pitch, figuratively and literally, just in case. It was finally in the mid-20s that the Disney Channel decided to give them a pilot to see the concept out. And the rest, as they say, is history. For those of you who have never seen an episode of Phineas and Ferb, here's a brief rundown. The series takes place during the summer vacation of two stepbrothers, Phineas and Ferb, who vow to make every day of their summer vacation special and interesting. The catch is that all of their ideas are so massive and industrial that they seem totally inappropriate for a group of kids, and thus destined to end in catastrophe. And because of this, their sister spends the majority of her summer vacation trying to bust them to her parents, often to no avail. That often repetitive story makes up the A-plot of most episodes, and it certainly seems like enough to fill an interesting 11-minute segment of any story. However, what makes Phineas and Ferb really stand out is the other half of every episode, the yang to Phineas and Ferb's ying, Professor Heinz Doofenshmirtz. Doofenshmirtz is a satire of the prototype Bond villain. He's an evil scientist with an endlessly long and tragic backstory who spends every day of the summer plotting evil. Sometimes that means taking over Danville in the tri-state area, but on most occasions it's something incredibly mundane and poorly thought out. For instance, on one occasion he plans to launch Big Ben into space and then land it near his apartment, entirely because he finds his watch too hard to read. As you can probably guess, Doofenshmirtz's plans are so ridiculous that they seem doomed to end in ultimate catastrophe. But many of them seem like they might actually work if it wasn't for the interference of Heinz's ultimate arch-nemesis, a secret agent named Perry the Platypus, aka Agent P. The A and B plots of the show might initially seem wholly irrelevant to one another, but in actuality they're strongly interconnected in numerous ways. The most obvious of these being that Agent P's secret identity is that of Phineas and Ferb's pet platypus, most well known for not doing much. It goes far past this, however, and I would argue that the greatest charm to the show overall is seeing how the two storylines of each episode do end up mirroring each other, and furthermore how the two elements usually cross paths at some point. Phineas and Ferb's projects, which are often ridiculous hazards and eyesores, often end up being whisked away or destroyed just before Candace can return home with her mom. These events are often directly caused by the B-plot. You almost get the sense that these two groups of people are the balance to one another's lives and schemes, as if blundersome evil and chaotic fun manage to cancel each other out, saving the town from likely destruction from one or the other. For instance, the only reason that Phineas and Ferb's city-sized roller coaster track disappears in the first episode is that Heinz's gigantic magnet gets attached to a helicopter and drags it to the other side of town. Phineas and Ferb will create plans involving an insane amount of frozen yogurt, and Doofenshmirtz will happen to have an evil plan that involves melting things from a distance. You get the idea. As the series progresses, Candace becomes increasingly paranoid about how every story transpires, and convinces herself to the existence of a mysterious force that always helps Phineas and Ferb and hinders her from attempts to bust them. As audience members, it's easy to laugh at this knowing the truth, that these circumstances are most usually the result of a secret agent platypus fighting an eccentric man dressed as a pharmacist. But when one really considers the events of the series as a whole instead of as individual parts, and how scientifically consistent the mysterious force proves to be, we can all come to one simple conclusion. Candace is right. The mysterious force is not a theory, not a vague guess, but a constant to this universe as it exists to these characters. Even when Phineas and Ferb's antics are unaffected by the B-plot, the same patterns form around them. Their plans always make no sense and should either fail to work or put them in extreme danger. They push through, gathering an impossible amount of materials in no time with few resources, and have an adventure which is rarely impacted by any disastrous consequences. Then, in a moment's notice, everything is fixed and nothing has to be brought up about the affair ever again. This is most obviously an in-universe representation of the writers trying to keep the formula of the show consistent. Phineas and Ferb can never get caught by their parents because it would mean the end of the show. And in the same way, the stories in the A and B plots could never cross paths naturally because their respective innocence is the core factor to every single episode taking place. What this all results in is a sort of in-universe mandate surrounding the two characters and their reputation. That being, when Phineas and Ferb are involved, anything that can go right will go right. Phineas and Ferb ran a total of 8 years on the Disney Channel network, totaling 222 episodes and 1 movie. Enough stories to span 2 whole summers and a couple of Christmases as well. Its legacy has become that of one of the greatest animated programs of the last decade, a household brand enjoyed by children and adults alike. It might seem like I'm jumping the gun here and discussing the end of the show so quickly, but Phineas and Ferb is the kind of show which becomes most interesting and worthy of analysis in its own afterlife, long after most have presumed that the curtains have drawn. And to most greatly understand this show, we have to discuss another. In 2015, several years after the end of their most famous work, Dan and Swampy returned to the Disney Network to produce a brand new show, entitled Milo Murphys Law. The series is inspired by the concept of Murphy's Law, an old adage which stipulates that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. The program has a lot of similarities to Phineas and Ferb. It's set in the same universe and even the same town and features the same cheery tone. But in most other ways, the shows are apples and oranges, extremely enjoyable and worthy of praise, but in totally different ways. And the reason that these two shows are so different boils down to their slightly different interpretation of the same basic theme, the interconnectedness of all things. Milo Murphy comes from a long line of Murphys, men so unlucky that they've become accustomed to bad things happening around them. Even a walk from one part of town to the other might result in constant destruction, if not for Milo's resourcefulness, as his backpack is always packed with enough materials to solve any situation. Phineas and Ferb is about the main characters attempting impossible and insane feats with everything going right, creating the best days ever. And Milo Murphys Law is about characters who are trying to do ordinary things, where everything goes wrong, descending their evenings into pure chaos. While Phineas and Ferb are organizing a backyard carnival or trying to prove the existence of the Loch Ness Monster, Milo Murphy is trying to get to school, or is playing game night with his family. All three have equally exciting lives. The difference is merely if this is by design or by chance. One of the greatest differences between how the two shows play out can be easily understood if one studies the B-plot of Milo Murphys Law. In this case, the yang to Milo Murphy's yin is not Professor Doofenshmirtz, but none other than Cavendish and Dakota. The first time we see these two characters is during the first few episodes of the show, where their presence is barely anything more than a running gag. We always see the pair involved with selling pistachios, and their stock is always destroyed because Milo is nearby. Surprisingly, only a few episodes later, this gets totally flipped on its head, and we find out that these two are actually not pistachio salesmen at all, but time agents from centuries into the future sent back to protect pistachios from going extinct. Because they're generally considered to be so inept that with any task more important, they would screw it up pretty badly. The implication of all this is that pistachios are extinct in the future partially because Milo is always around them, and that the two always fail at their mission because of his presence. This seems like a pretty fun status quo, but it actually then goes in a place that's really surprising for these writers. After a few stories with this pretense, Cavendish and Dakota see Milo, essentially noticing the existence of the A-plot and piecing together that their lives are mysteriously connected to his. The two immediately think that Milo is some sort of spy spent to foil their missions, making them feel much more self-important, and forcing them to investigate Milo and his friends even further. Again, this seems like a pretty alright base dynamic for these characters, good enough to stretch 200 or so episodes with a brief payoff in the finale. But then, a few episodes later, Dakota again does something totally unprecedented, and suggests that they just talk to Milo to actually figure out what's going on. And thus, the characters in the B-plot approach the characters in the A-plot and have a discussion with them, causing both characters to understand the other half of the program with absolutely no secrecy between them, something which feels totally unprecedented to any show like this before. Phineas Fletcher and Milo Murphys' respective shows were created a decade apart, and that has had a big impact on how they both play out because television has changed a lot between 2007 and today. The money in television used to be based thoroughly in syndication, where episodes of old shows would be shown as reruns and would thus usually be shown out of order. Today, most people consume media not by catching random episodes on TV, but by binging them online through services like Netflix, or perhaps more relevantly, Disney+. Because of this, Milo Murphy expects you to watch the series from the start, and all the way through, in chronological order, while Phineas and Ferb was created to embrace and mock its perpetual 222-episode status quo purgatory. The first episode I ever saw of the show was titled Journey to the Center of Candace, and what stuck with me more than anything else was a gag where Dr. Doofenshmirtz announces to Perry that he's decided to do their regular routine out of order to mix it up, deciding to tell Perry about his plan and then put him in a trap. This, of course, goes very badly for him. I remember watching that one episode and thinking at the end that this had to be one of the greatest shows I had ever seen, and it was partially because of the fourth wall glaring humor that was constantly present throughout it. Every character has some element to their nature that the show repeats to the point of making fun of their own repetition. And while that's a really funny gag when you're watching one episode every few weeks, I must admit that it can be a little tiresome. And frankly, I find the growth that the characters go through in Milo Murphys Law to be much more interesting. For instance, at the start of the show, most of the students at the school try to keep their distance from Milo because of his mathematically provable bad luck. But the most notable example of these is a girl named Amanda Lopez, who is extremely organized by nature and wants nothing to do with the Milo family curse. Through the series, she ends up spending a lot of time with Milo, and she slowly begins to appreciate how caring he can be despite the trouble that he inadvertently causes. And when she takes one step closer to understanding and appreciating him, she never takes a step back. It's really satisfying to see her grow at such a natural pace because of the events going on around them. And with all that taken into account, it kind of hurts to think that at the exact same time that this is happening, Phineas and Isabella are spending time together with the exact same dynamic as ever, stuck in this perpetual loop that can never end as long as their stories keep being told. I think this seriously plays into the differences between the themes of the two shows. I deeply believe that development and change is caused to some extent by chaos and lack of consistency. Those are all things that the cast of Phineas and Ferb never have to face. Their lives are perfect in perpetual repetition with no drama and no bad endings. And because of this, I think they're only happy because of their innocence, their lack of understanding that there is more to the world than what they understand. And what's shocking is I truly think that Milo's friends, despite pulling the statistical short straw, are a lot happier because of having him around. In the first episode, when Milo has just met Zach and the two have gone through numerous hectic detours on their way to school, Milo makes the case that despite everything he goes through, he wouldn't have his life any other way.
You want to live like those other kids? They took a bus to school today. A bus! Does that seem like more fun to you?
Oh, Milo is voiced by Weird Al. I don't know if I've explained that yet, Sometimes he sings. That's one of the main reasons I watch. This is my only resource for modern Weird Al songs. So we've come to understand how these two shows function differently despite their similar pretenses. But one of the most interesting elements isn't just how they exist on their own, but also how they coexist within the same basic arena. At this point, I'm going to spoil a lot of the best parts of the show, so if you're already convinced to watch the series and you don't want me to ruin your experience, I strongly suggest closing the video now and finding a place to watch it all. Because the writers most likely wanted to prove that the concept of Milo Murphys Law worked on a standalone basis, they originally kept the connections between the shows very sparse, usually limiting them to brief callbacks and quotes. It was during the episode Murphy's Lard that all of this changed. At the start of the story, we find out that despite visiting a lard-based theme park, Melissa actually has a crippling fear of roller coasters. When asked to explain why, she explains that some time ago, on the first day of summer, someone dropped a roller coaster on her house.
I used to love roller coasters, but I didn't know they could drop from the sky and crush your dreams.
The clever illustration that one event happening in Phineas and Ferb, acting as good luck, could also appear in the lives of the Milo Murphy cast as bad luck is the first indication we ever get that the parallels between their respective lives is purposeful on part of the creators, let alone that the two shows have any connections at all. However, it's at the finale of the first season that things really start to take off. Through a long storyline spread throughout, a specific pistachio plant ends up surviving, leading to a hyper-evolved race called the Pistachions taking over the future, where Cavendish and Dakota are from. While the time agents and Milo are able to stop them, one is sent back in time to the 1960s, where he slowly plots to take over the tri-state area over the next 50 years. Milo and the time agents end up trapped in a dystopian present, being taken over by Pistachions, and realize that the only way to fix the situation is to find the man who will one day invent time travel, who the agents only know as Professor Time. When they investigate Professor Time by going to his address as listed on their devices, the man they discover there is none other than Professor Heinz Doofenshmirtz, who, having turned good during the series finale of Phineas and Ferb, will apparently one day invent time travel and take on a new alias for branding. What follows is a 40-minute crossover epic bringing together the best elements of these two shows, as Phineas and Ferb cross paths with Milo Murphy and the group decide to find a way to weaponize the confusion that occurs when the mysterious force meets Murphy's Law. I won't spoil the entire special because it's really something worth seeing on your own time. What's actually interesting to me is what happens after it. With most crossovers, they happen in such a contained way that they don't tend to affect the worlds of either show. However, in this case, the episode actually permanently changes how the show plays out. Dr. Doofenshmirtz becomes a recurring main character in Milo's world, and several other Phineas and Ferb characters begin also showing up rather often as a result of this. This is interesting in part because it's a side of this character that we've never had the chance to see before. We've always accepted Heinz as this cartoonish evil failure who spends every day of his summer doing the exact same thing with the same people, and always fails to grow. And now instead we get to see him living a new life on the side of good, trying something new every week and often failing to find success, all while this idea of Professor Time, this person that everyone expects him to become, lingers over his head. Heinz Doofenshmirtz has evolved so much over his existence on TV, that while he once was this general spoof of all bad guys, he's become this very deeply relatable and somewhat tragic figure who just wants to right his wrongs and move on, but is having trouble handling the transition between the two worlds that he seems to have leaped between. This is something that's been built on pretty heavily in both shows, and I think it's partially that the writers of Phineas and Ferb started to feel really bad for this character they'd made and tormented for years, so they started to make him a little bit less of a bad guy as time went on. And I've really loved seeing him again after all these years, and it's really exciting to think that his new lease on life in this new show he's been sent on hasn't even been concluded yet, and I'm just so excited to see what they're going to do with all this. I'm worried that people are going to watch this video and see it as me trying to trash one of these shows while praising the other, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Phineas and Ferb and Milo Murphys Law are both fantastic shows, but for entirely different reasons. The former is this brilliant representation of the vague image we all have of what childhood was like. As much as it's literally about these characters having these adventures, it's also a little bit about what it's like having an imagination as a child. And because of that, the tone and pacing tends to fit what they're going for. Milo Murphys Law is about characters living real lives in a world that doesn't make sense, but trying to enjoy it despite all that. Under that lens, the show represents a lot of what it's like to actually live your life as a real adult. Always pushing to see the next day and taking it all for the ride, despite the numerous ways that things seem to go wrong. These are shows about holistic harmony and holistic chaos. They are so close yet so apart, and are by far the two most brilliant representations of purposeful theming that I've seen in television in a very long time. Thank you for watching again this week, guys. If you'd like to see more content like this, be sure to check out some of my other videos, like the one currently popping up, hopefully. Also, you may notice some names crawling at the bottom of the screen as of now. These are my supporters who have donated $6 or more to my Patreon. Patreon supporters also get early access to scripts and even finished videos just like this one. So if you're interested in any of that, check out the link in the description below. With that, I've been Quinton Reviews, and that's all you need.